llegado el momento, uno de los momentos más esperados de esta 11ª edición del EdTech Congress Barcelona, y vamos a dar una calurosa bienvenida a un profesor, Neil Selwyn. Este es uno de los momentos, como os decía, más esperados. Él es un profesor que viene de la Universidad de Melbourne, de Australia, y no sé si lo tengo por aquí delante. Neil, welcome here. You could come. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to hear you here. Yeah. Neil Selwyn is a professor in the Faculty of Education, Monash University, Melbourne, having previously worked in the Institute of Education, London, and the Cardiff School of Social Sciences. He has spent the past 30 years researching the integration of digital technology into schools, universities, and adult learning. Neil is recognized as a leading international researcher in the area of digital education, with particular expertise in the real-life constraints and problems faced when technology-based education is implemented. He's currently working on nationally funded projects examining the rollout of educational data and learning analytics, AI technology, and the changing nature of teachers' digital work. Neil, he produces the Meet the Education Researcher and Education Technology Society podcast. Recent books include Digital Degrowth, Radically Rethinking Our Digital Futures, and Critical Data Literacies and Facial Recognition. Thank you very much to be here. Cannot wait to hear from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I want to apologize because I cannot speak Catalan and I cannot speak Spanish, so I'd want to give a big thanks to the translator, because if there wasn't a translator, I wouldn't be able to say anything. And I want to be slightly different in this session. This is going to be a slightly different turn of events. I've been working since 1995 as a critic of education technology, and I want to convince you that there's value in you also being critical too, especially in these current times. I want to really think ambitiously about how we might do education technology differently in the future. So the theme of this event is thinking about the future. Let's try and think radically differently about what EdTech could be in the future. Now, I know that events like this are always very uplifting and optimistic. People that work in education technology, I think, have a pretty straightforward mindset. You work in EdTech because you want to try and improve education with technology. That's why we're all in this area. And so shows like this will always focus on the potential of emerging technologies. You come here expecting to see best practice, proofs of concept, state of the art, cool technologies, cool ideas. And this is really understandable. It's a kind of human thing. And in most areas of life, we're conditioned to think about digital technology in terms of solutions, not in terms of problems. We think about technology-driven improvements. We think about tech will save us, and that's a really comforting thought. And especially in education, where we have a lot of huge problems that we need to be addressed. And so I've been doing this, as I said, for 30 years, and this field has always retained an enthusiasm and a positivity for technology, which I think is great. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not sustainable. We can't carry on thinking technology is going to make everything better. And actually, outside a show like this, I think the general mood and the general vibe, if that's a word I can use, is definitely shifting around education and technology. We are seeing parents and news media having panics about screen time, demanding technology-free childhoods. We're seeing governments enacting mobile phone bans in schools all around the world. We're seeing attempts to try and get devices out of classrooms, to try and return to paper books. We're seeing fights against Google in Denmark and fights against Microsoft in France. We're seeing teachers and students protest against AI and personal learning. And we're seeing a regular kind of procession of scandals and controversies involving education technology, where education technology is not turning out to be a very helpful thing to all sorts of different students. Now, we've referred to this as a kind of a techlash that's popular now And we need to think about that. Now, I'm sure for many people here today, you're thinking, well, people that think like this is completely unwarranted. These are people that don't understand technology. But if we're being honest, the idea that the digitalization of education over the past 20, 30, 40 years has become increasingly a cause for concern rather than a cause for celebration, it's really difficult to dismiss that. We've had technology in schools now, computers in schools, for 40 years. We've had the World Wide Web for 25 years now. This is not new technology. And so my honest question is, given this very long history of cool technology, thinking differently, is education actually better off for all of the computerization and all the digitalization that we've seen over the past 20 years, say? And for me, I find it very difficult to say, yes, it's all been fantastic. I think any benefits of digital technology have certainly not scaled up on a widespread, sustainable basis. We've got plenty of cool use cases of technology, plenty of really exciting technology, but these are only exciting use cases in isolation. When you look at the bigger picture, technology does not seem to be benefiting every student, every school. And in fact, you could argue that technology is making many people's education experiences and their educational lives worse. All of the big ticket problems that we have in education have persisted over the 40 years: inequality, inefficiency, unfairness. So we know that digital technologies can be a fantastic addition to schools, to classrooms, in many different ways, but the types of technology that we're most commonly seeing in our schools and universities and other education settings, I think, are quite problematic. So this is the problem that I'm kind of trying to grapple with. Although we know that tech can be cool, the actually existing technology, as opposed to the technology we might want to wish existed, I don't think is as good as it could be. And so for me, I don't think we can just have a huge celebration around EdTech in 2025. I don't want to be sitting there where everything is just burning down saying this is fine, because I don't think everything is fine. So there's a lot, I think, about EdTech that we can be critical of. Now, not everybody thinks that EdTech is perfect, I'm sure, but my concern is that most people that work in the area of education technology are perhaps a little bit reluctant to be critical. You don't really want to focus on the dark side of digitalization. But I think that the popular techlash that I was just talking about reflects wider social problems and serious problems that we do actually need to discuss and reflect on at a show like this. Very, very short list of things I could think of, and this is not exhaustive. And I'm sure those of you that teach or study in a school or a university will have another long list of things. But for me, I think we do need to talk about how many of the big promises over the past 20 years about technology have not really been fulfilled. I'm not sure that all this technology has made education more efficient. I'm not sure all this technology has made education more flexible. I'm not sure all this technology has made education more fun, more enjoyable, more inspiring. And I'm certainly not sure all this technology has made education more fair or equitable or democratic or just. I'm pretty sure all of this digitalization has made education more complicated. So there are lots of things I think we need to talk about. The fact that education technology doesn't necessarily work in the same ways for everybody. There are big digital divides, big digital inequalities, and we saw this during COVID. When education technology and the shift to remote emergency learning took place, there were huge inequalities all around the world. This UNESCO report is well worth reading, an EdTech tragedy, basically looking at how technology, although it helped us get by, didn't actually lead to very equitable forms of learning during COVID. And we see it during lots and lots of different types of technology. I think we do need to think about the ways that technology have perhaps not improved learning for everybody. I think if you're a teacher, you know that technology's made your work more complicated, a lot more work, not a lot less work. And I think we also need to think about the ways that the education technologies that we have in schools and universities are actually part of perhaps the worst aspects of our institutions, the managerialism, authoritarianism tendencies of our schools and universities. And then there are some other huge elephants in the room, if that's a phrase that translates to Catalan. How EdTech is supporting the corporate capture of public education. We now have schools that say, I'm a Google school, we're a Microsoft school. We have big tech firms that now have an increasing influence over what takes place in our classrooms. And then, the really big elephant in the room is about the environmental harms that come from all of this technology. The e-waste, the rare metal mining, the carbon footprint from hyperscale data centers. There's lots of things I think we need to actually kind of talk about when we're talking about what we want EdTech to be. So, anyway, the whole long list of things that are quite depressing, I suppose, rather than uplifting. So when I normally say these sorts of things to particularly people that work in the EdTech industry, the usual response is, well, you don't understand what you're talking about the wrong technology, you're a Luddite. And I think we need to think about these responses, because I'm not sure these responses are good enough. I'm sure you can all show me examples of where tech works wonderfully, but the point is, it doesn't work like that on a large-scale basis. You could argue tech works really well for you personally, and you could say, well, you're using tech now, why are you being so critical about it? But the fact it works for me doesn't mean to say it will work in the same way for everybody else. I'm very privileged. I have a MacBook Air, I have tech support. The technological affordances that I have are not the same as lots of other people. There's often a very popular response to say, well, these are just we can fix these problems. And it's really nice to think we can fix these problems. But a lot of the problems I've just talked about are huge problems. Inequality, worse work. These are not things that can be recoded or tweaked. And the other argument you'll often find from people working in the tech industry to say, well, the next wave of technology in 5 years' time is going to be brilliant. You wait, AI is going to change everything. And again, I don't think we can think like that, because that's just speculation. You have no idea whether AI is going to be any different to the past 40 years of EdTech. In fact, I think it's probably not. And also this idea of if you're being negative about technology, you're being anti-innovation. Now, hopefully I can show in a minute that by being critical, we can be even more innovative and even more thinking outside the box about what technology could be. So I want to just say, I think being critical is not the same as being negative. Being skeptical is not the same as being cynical. And in fact, taking this approach to technology can, I think, be a really useful way of thinking how things might be different. So I want us to embrace the critical mindset about EdTech. Don't take it personally. Don't respond to criticism in a hostile manner. I think we can be receptive rather than dismissive of criticism. And I think actually the EdTech field is mature enough now, we've been doing this for 40 years, to actually be curious and critical about how digital technologies come together, and to be critical in a constructive manner. And this is key to what I'm trying to argue here today. I think everyone in this area has a common aim of making education better through technology. And so being critical, I think, is a key way of thinking about how EdTech can be better. The idea about being critical is not saying everything is terrible. The idea about being critical about EdTech is to try and think otherwise, to try and think how things might be completely different. So there's a great German theorist called Mercedes Bunz, and she puts, as he puts it here, the key motivation of being critical about technology is to want to live with technology on our own terms, how we want technology to be. Similarly, Genevieve Bell talks about being critical is actually about critically doing stuff rather than just critical thinking. So the best forms of criticism don't just debunk and deconstruct, but they try and reassemble things in the ways that we actually want them to be. And so that's why I really want to think about the critical approach we can take at conferences like this. I'm really interested in thinking about critical hope. I'm really interested in thinking about post-critical, and there's a great kind of educational movement now called post-critical pedagogy. And this is a really interesting way of thinking about things, not just pointing out what's wrong, but pointing out how we might think things to be in the future. So Hodgson and other people that talk about post-critical approaches argue that this is working out what we think is good in the world that's worth preserving, and actually being vocal about what we think is of value when it comes to education and what's of value when it comes to technology. And then trying to foster collective concern to preserve the really valuable bits of technology and education that are not normally celebrated and not normally kind of sold, but we think are actually worth having. And then building new forms of EdTech that can protect and uplift these values. So one of the key things about this approach to being critical about technology is that we can be hopeful. And I think hope is a really good word to use, rather than optimism. And I said at the beginning, these shows are often optimistic. I would rather that these shows are hopeful, because hope is slightly different. And again, there's some great literature on what hope means, but this isn't just, Jeffrey Duncan Underay talks about false hope or hokey hope or mythical hope, hope that's never going to happen. He talks about critical hope. And critical hope is about doing things and building stuff, working in the cracks, working around the edges, challenging what's currently dominant. And I think in 2025, we can think otherwise about the dominant forms of EdTech, the big tech, the big platforms, the big systems, the technologies that we think there are no alternatives to. I think we can think differently. So the big challenge here is, what do we want to see? What kind of EdTech would you really want to see in the future? And I think if we're talking about these sorts of things, we're not really talking about the technology, the circuit boards and the screens. We're talking about values. And this is one of the key things I want to try and get across today. For me, I want to talk about the values around EdTech, what values we think we want to see in EdTech, and how we can actually have EdTech with those values. And this is the idea of better EdTech. Better EdTech is a matter of values. When you say anything, better is a value judgment, isn't it? It's a heavily loaded term. When I say I want better EdTech, it's not an objective matter. It's not a technical matter. It's not a matter of efficiency or coding. It's a moral decision. It's a decision about relative goodness. So when I'm deeming one version of EdTech better than another, we're making judgments about the morals and the values of the education that we want, of the education technology that we want. So there's no one right answer to what better EdTech is. I can't give you the one answer to this. We have to work it out for ourselves. And I think this is what I want to think about. How can we collectively reimagine what we all agree would be a better form of EdTech? So that's the challenge. What values might you want to see in your hoped-for version of EdTech? And what would it take to achieve this? And I'd be really interested to hear what the students think about this in terms of how might things be different. What values are driving our own desired versions of EdTech? What would it take to achieve this? Now, it's really easy to put this on a PowerPoint slide. It's much, much more difficult to actually do it. And thinking otherwise about digital technology is really, really difficult. Because we've been conditioned to think that the current situation that we have with big tech, big platforms, big data, that there is no alternative. It has to be like this. But we've only had this for 20 years. I'm sure in another 20 years we won't have the forms of tech that we have now. So we should be able to be confident to think about things being different. We can move on from this moment of 3 screens for everybody, everything in the cloud, always streaming, digital excess, which I think is why we're having a bit of this digital backlash. And we can think differently. It's not easy to do because a lot of us are really invested in the types of technology that we currently have, but it is possible. And outside of education, there's more and more people being interested in this. And one of the key things that one of my colleagues, Felicitas McGilchrist, talks about is the idea to design differently. We can design differently EdTech. We can design differently tech in all forms of life, but particularly in EdTech. And there's all sorts of movements outside of education now thinking about how we can design differently and do differently. And I'd really love education to do that as well. There's some really interesting people in the feminist technology area, queer tech, crip technoscience, black software, radical sustainable computing, digital degrowth, computing with limits. There's a big literature, and there are lots of people trying to think differently about what technology might be in the future, if we're living in a climate-constrained future, for example. We can do this. And most of these ideas are not coming from Silicon Valley or San Francisco. They're coming from non-Western perspectives. They're coming from the global south. They're coming from indigenous knowledges. There's a lot here that we can actually use and build upon. And this is what I'm really interested in thinking about. How can we take other values and add them to the technology that we have in schools? Now, as I say, there's no right way of doing this. Everyone will have different answers. this is just my own ideas. I would love to see my better EdTech is EdTech that's better for people, better for communities, and better for the planet. Is it possible to have forms of EdTech that are genuinely centered around the needs of people? You might say this is a kind of humane EdTech, EdTech that has values of kindness, care, compassion, EdTech that's sensitive towards the vulnerabilities of learning or the pleasures of learning, that are concerned with collective well-being, and actually forms of EdTech that work really well with contradiction and nuance and just the mess of human life. I'd love to see EdTech that's like that. Is it possible to have EdTech that's much more about communities? A lot of the technologies that we have at the moment are hyper-individualized. They're hyper-personalized. It's about the individual learning on their own. I would love to see technology that makes local communities work and teach and live together, that's built around mutual obligations and trust, social connections. And also, is it possible to have forms of EdTech that are better attuned to the needs of the planet, that are designed to actually fit with the resource constraints and the environmental limits of the world that we live in? I don't think we can carry on having 3 screens and streaming everything for the next 20 years. So how can we think differently? So these are the types of EdTech I'd like to be thinking about. What about you? And I think you can all think about different ways that you might want to have tech that's a bit more inclusive or a bit fairer, or is actually based around the idea of education as a public good, or even public education. And what's really interesting is that forms of technology that have these values do already exist. We can go outside and find these forms of technologies. And I really like this idea of the now-topia, which is something that Chris Carlson and Francesca Manning talked about. The alternatives that already exist in the cracks. You have lots of these in Barcelona, actually, right to repair workshops, bicycle workshops, guerrilla gardening, pirate programming. There's a lot of this going on in Barcelona. But EdTech and tech, we also have alternative versions like this. And these are just examples of how things might be differently. So there's lots of different examples I've been thinking about. I was really taken during COVID about all the cool stuff that people did with technology for education on a really informal basis. So we saw some amazing WhatsApp groups where parents and teachers and students got together and worked out how they might be organizing their remote learning. We saw community wireless programs where all of a sudden schools could give devices and Wi-Fi to families that didn't have the devices. And we saw the rise of TikTok learning and teachers teaching on all sorts of there are all sorts of really interesting informal ways of using technology for education that were much more collective, that were much more improvised, were much more, I think, genuinely human. I'm also fascinated by the idea of design justice. There's a whole group of people in the States now that are thinking about how you can design differently. And crucially, not building technology to fit the system, what the system wants, but building it to fit the people who have to survive within the system. It's a really interesting way of designing with marginalized communities. There's things like platform cooperativism, which is booming in lots of different areas. And again, it's really interesting to see how education might take the platform cooperative approach. There are lots of different ideas about using open data and open knowledge, and the idea of tech being a commons rather than a private thing. I think there are, again, some really interesting things that we might want to think about there in terms of how tech might be different. The best EdTech platform, the biggest EdTech platform, I think, in the world is Wikipedia. Non-profit, community-driven. It's an amazing example about how we might actually organize things. And then you've got things like the Raspberry Pi, the single kind of simple circuit computer, which can be used for some really powerful things and doesn't involve every kid having a MacBook Air, but shows how computing can be small. And then there's all lots of things that take place under the radar, often through libraries. I think libraries is where all the really, really good, cool stuff takes place. As I said, right to repair shops, lending devices to people rather than everyone having to own their own device, public access. And then I'm really interested, as well as right to repair, how community groups are beginning to work. And if you're a teacher and you're interested about how you can actually think more critically about tech, there's a really good group called Civics of Technology, which produces resources for teachers and professional learning and for using in the classroom to think through some of it. And again, it's a much more collective approach to what AI literacy or digital literacy might be. So none of these are perfect. Wikipedia communities are not brilliant. They're quite exclusive. The Raspberry Pi Foundation recently floated for $50 million on the web. They're not perfect, but they just show how you can use tech differently with different values. So I like these examples because of the principles that they show us. They give us some ideas about what we can build on. So I want you to be thinking critically about technology, but I want you to also be thinking hopefully. And I think the more we can talk like this, the more we can have conversations about what types of tech we might want, what we're not happy with the tech that we've got, the more that we can have a maturing field of EdTech. I think we can have more grown-up conversations around education and technology now. And one good thing about being a grown-up is you can have a sense of balance, a sense of perspective, a sense of realism. You can be hopeful, but you're not going to be delusional. And so Kerry Facer and I called this non-stupid optimism. I think we can be optimistic, but in a non-stupid way. These technologies not going to transform everything, revolutionize the education system, but we can make a difference in a much more slow way. So regardless of whether your default position is to think tech is brilliant, or to be super positive, or to be super critical, I think we can all become much more comfortable about thinking otherwise about technology, talking about radically different forms of technology that we might want to see and what it would take to support them. But there's lots of work to do. We need to work together. The critics and the boosters, the government, universities, industry, EdTech firms, we need to actually work together with each other, have these conversations and try and work out what we might be able to do together. And I think we need to be more forceful in speaking up about what we're not happy about in terms of EdTech. Students need to speak up much more about what they're not happy about. Academics are in a really privileged position, and so are journalists, to be able to actually not have to say, oh, technology is wonderful, blah, blah, blah. So we have to be able to speak up in a more strong way. And actually, even people working in the IT industry can make really powerful changes about values. You can have conversations in your workplaces about the values that your work is grounded in. And we saw that a few years back when Google and Microsoft employees said, we do not want to be creating technologies that are used for warfare. We don't want to be building war technologies. And that's about value. So we could do that in EdTech. And so I think I want to reframe EdTech as something to argue about, something to challenge, and something to change. Now, this is not normally stuff that you talk about in a show like this, so I appreciate that. So it's lovely to see you here, and I hope you all have a great show. Do continue to get excited about technology, but do continue to get excited about alternatives. And for me, reinventing EdTech is a genuinely innovative challenge. If you want innovation, try and reimagine what EdTech is completely. I think this would require us all thinking a long way outside the box. So digital technology in education is not going away, but I think there are plenty of reasons to be hopeful that it could be and should be a lot better. So thank you very much.